Hi everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker for the afternoon. First up will be Vic Morfin, who is the Forest Fuels Specialist on the Coconino National Forest.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm out of Flagstaff, Arizona, work for the Coconino, as described, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Mormon fire. And wanted to just point out that this past year was our most productive year in terms of managing fires for resource objectives. 2009 was another big year. You heard Tessa and Nicolay talk about. In 2009, we burned about 15,000 acres of prescribed fire on forest and got about 23,000 acres of what used to be called wildland fire use in 2009. This last year, we burned the same, about 15,000 acres, but we managed to achieve over 50,000 of what used to be called fire use. So that was a really big year for us, and pretty proud of that. And I'd also point out that we get about 400 wildfires a year on the Coconino, and about 150 to 200 of those are lightning fires, so potential candidates. And having said that, we still manage less than 10% of our fires for resource objectives, closer to 3 to 5% most years. So still just a fraction of our fires that we're actually managing for resource objectives. Okay, I think that's the most important part in the beginning, is to let you know that I'm not talking about an unwanted, unplanned type of fire that Smokey the Bear warned us about. I'm talking about one of these, used to be called fire use. Sorry to keep using that word, but at least you know what I'm talking about. And it started in mid-May on the Flagstaff district of the Coconino National Forest and burned for almost 8,000 acres. Could have been a little closer to 10,000 with our planning box, but we did not burn the last couple thousand, and you'll see why here in a bit. Sorry, it looked like I missed a slide here. Okay, well, I'll talk about the conditions at the time. Nationally, there wasn't a whole lot going on. Planning level, for a lot of you know, is a scale from 1 to 5 of activity, and we were at level 1, meaning basically little to no activity nationally. The activity we did have was pretty much centered in the southwest area, and we were, when the fire started, we were around planning level 2, and more towards June, we bumped up to level 3. So still not a lot of activity, so that meant lots of resource availability. We could pick up hotshot crews, air tankers as needed. So there was some activity, but not a whole lot. But important to note that we're approaching peak fire season. For those of you not from the area, mid-May through the end of June is our peak fire season. So it was on our minds that peak fire season's coming, and along with that comes, instead of the fire behavior that you're kind of seeing there from one of the days of ignition, we would get into undesirable fire effects and fire with high resistance to control, and what some would call bad fire. So that was on our mind. It was coming, we felt, soon, but we didn't know when, because we can't predict the future. And I point that out because the public's asking about campfire restrictions. Why aren't you? Had been for a couple weeks leading up to this fire. So that's on our mind. And then there's somewhat of a sense of urgency. And maybe that's a little bit overstated, but I would say myself and the trainee incident commander talked a lot about it's going to turn bad at some point. We don't know if that point is 5 days from now or 10 days from now, but we know from burning in the spring, we get a 2 to 4 day window. We go out, we burn for a couple days, and then we go out and light a test fire the next day, and it's up, off, and running. You know, it's up in the trees, and we're getting undesirable effects. So we feel that we're just not there yet. Right now, conditions are great. Okay, another consideration going on at the time, we had numerous fires that aren't on this map, but you see Flagstaff up to the north. Our fire is in the X, the Mormon fire. Those other flames, like the Cowboy and the Jack fire, were other fires that were going on our forest. At this time, when it started mid-May, third week of May, these other fires were type 4 fires, fairly low complexity. However, as we transitioned into a type 3 status, a more complex fire, these other fires would be right there with it. All of our fires kind of transferred into type 3 incidents within a few days of each other. And so there's obviously some challenges associated with that. It being in season is a big deal. Like I said, our first in season was in 2009. So that kind of got us over the hump. But managing several in-season fires simultaneously can be a challenge for things like resource commitment. We're pretty fat on the forest. We have 3 hotshot crews, about a dozen engines, etc. But when you're trying to balance that and bounce those people around and bring in other resources, it can become a balancing act. There are things like cumulative smoke impacts. If we decide on the Mormon fire and the Cowboy fire to ignite on the same day, we might pound Flagstaff with cumulative smoke and destroy some of our credibility with the public. So wanted to point out some of those challenges of having multiple Type 3 fires going at once on one unit. And we were able to overcome that partially due to the fact that the Mormon fire and the Cowboy fire, we had joint planning meetings at night. It was a little tough for the Mogollon Rim folks to come up and join us due to logistics, but these 2 fires, we met nightly and went over our strategy and whatnot as a group. So all the incident commanders and fire leadership were in the same room, same agency administrator, and we could talk about some of those cumulative impacts of our actions and what our plans were cumulatively. Okay, so the big question, why this fire? Like I said, we get 150 to 200 candidates a year, so why did we choose to go here? And the biggest reason by far was Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, which I know many of you are familiar with, but those that are not, it's a very high profile project on the Coconino. It was approved in 2012 by a vote in the city of Flagstaff where the people of Flagstaff essentially voted for a tax increase to fund a project that was done primarily on federal land. And I think this was, at the time, certainly the only one in the nation, and I don't know what that status is now, but it was a pretty big project and unique. And then backing up a bit in time, the reason that FWPP came to fruition was primarily because of the Schultz fire. There were folks thinking about it, folks in this room, knowing that we needed to protect our watershed, but when we had the Schultz fire of 2010 and an unwanted, uncharacteristic large stand replacement type of fire, the post-fire effects, the floods that followed the fire were a major problem in East Flagstaff, causing property damage, road damage, and unfortunately even a fatality of a young girl that got swept away in the floodwaters. So I think that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, that lit a fire under Flagstaff in general that this is a problem and we need to deal with it. There's FWPP is 2 project areas. North of Flagstaff. Flagstaff is that gray splat of urban sprawl there. That's Flag. Just above us is Dry Lake Hills. And so obviously we know that if we were to get a large uncharacteristic type of fire above the town, it would probably result in mud flows through downtown Flagstaff. So that's one area that we're hoping to protect. And the other part is down here at Mormon Mountain. And this is our fire, our candidate fire. And so this is Mormon Mountain, all this dark green. And the north aspects of Mormon flow into Upper and Lower Lake Mary right there, that long body of water. And that's our main reservoir in Flagstaff. So that's why FWPP was a factor for us way down by Mormon Mountain. FWPP was at risk with this fire. It was a value at risk is how we tend to coin it. But we saw a great opportunity with these fuel conditions to be able to treat west of that mountain and protect the mountain, so to speak. And we knew that we weren't probably going to get that opportunity too often. And at some point, a fire will come along in May, June, and it would be an uncharacteristic large fire that would probably go up the side of Mormon Mountain. So we thought we were on the ground to protect it. Here's some of the values at risk. These are just socio-political values at risk. We had natural resource values like Mexican spotted owl and northern goshawk that aren't on here, but they were out there just like they were in your scenario yesterday. And there were also a couple things that I didn't denote. That's private property up by the K, Antelope Park, and Horse Park, Little Horse Park is down, down in here. So that was private property within the project area. A couple of we thought would get impacted with smoke, Munns Park and the village of Oak Creek, just due to location, how close it was to our candidate fire. Likely to be impacted would be Flagstaff to the north and Sedona. And I say less likely because typically in the summer we're getting southwest flow, and Flag is quite a ways. So in Sedona, we felt with the high pressure and the southern flow that we normally get in fire season, Sedona would not be much of a factor, and we were wrong on that one. I'd also point out that during this time period that I'm going to show you the progression map here, we had very good and excellent ventilation every day, and that's typical in the summer during the fire season. So on May 25th is when the Type 3 team took over the fire. The fire had been in Type 4 status for the previous 10 days, and they handed us a really good package. By that I mean it was basically secure around the edge. They had assessed a lot of the values at risk and came up with a good plan of action to move from there. In fact, Wesley Hall was the IC4 trainee. I think he's in the room. And then so we inherited it on this day. And the reason I have a Wednesday there, because generally days don't matter on fires, whether it's a Saturday or a Monday or Wednesday, it's all the same. But we have an upcoming holiday, right? Memorial Day is the 30th, so that's why the day is in there. So when we inherited the fire, we were a couple days from getting an influx of visitors from Phoenix. Memorial Day weekend, folks are coming out. It's 110 degrees in Phoenix, and we get mass visitation up at 1,000 feet where it's quite a bit cooler. So there was a decision made initially to cease ignition on all our fires, and that was basically held true for our fires minus the jack fire that was getting pushed really hard towards power lines, KV lines, and so we were firing around KV lines to protect them, but other than that, we weren't doing any firing. And this really made myself and the incident commander trainee on this fire very nervous, because we have fire just west of that big mountain. And as you can see by the dark green on there, it's getting up into mixed conifer, heavy, dead and down, typical 8,800 foot type of mountain in the southwest. A lot of fuel, a lot of potential if we were to get fire up on that mountain. And we knew fire season's coming, so we were pretty uncomfortable just letting fire sit 5 or 6 days and then hoping to pick it up in a week, because we knew conditions could be dramatically different in a week. So talking with our line officers, we agreed to take a conservative approach, that we understood we'd have mass visitation in the woods and we didn't want to smoke those people out, but we also wanted to protect this mountain and get some fire on the west edge of that mountain so that we could get through this period and meet some objectives and protect the mountain and not lose our opportunity. So we took a measured approach, is how I would describe it. So that sliver is about a mile long, and that's actually 2 days of ignition. At that elbow was 1 day. We took it up to that elbow. So that's 2 days, less than 80 acres probably. So that was that conservative approach. And then the next day, we took out that little dog leg that you saw down here. We didn't want that to come together in a bad way, so we kind of straightened that out. And this looks kind of suspicious, and there's a reason why we jumped up to that private property. We had east winds forecasted this day, and east wind, especially during fire season, is a fairly rare event. And so we wanted to take advantage of that and protect that private property while we could keep smoke off of it and not burn with the southwest flow and put smoke on the folks that live there. So that's why you have that gap. The following day, we connected the dots. Once again, we had this unwanted gap there, and so this would be the following day. So that's 5 days of ignition. And on that day, we basically took out the gap and then brought the private burn, the burn protecting the private, to a road. So now we're at Memorial Day. We're through that critical period of visitation, and I don't know, maybe 800 tops in those 5 days. That's how conservative we were in going forward. And so the next slide I'm going to show you is the next 3 or 4 days of ignition. You'll see we did more each of those days than we did in the previous 5. And then later slide, you'll see why we were going so slow. So that's what from May 31st on. Once we had those earlier polygons, the 5 days of burning in here, we felt a sigh of relief because we felt the mountain was much better protected, and then we were able to helicopter ignitions those next 3 or 4 days and take that the rest of the project out. Wanted to show you this management area 4. This is all private. You can see those houses maybe, depending on where you're sitting. Our project line was somewhere in here, which would have been an additional 2,000 acres, but we didn't do it for reasons you'll see in a second. I wish this was the end of the story right here, that all ended well with no incident. But that's what Sedona, May 28th, according to the date stamp. I think it may have been May 29th. I have suspicions, and I could talk about that more during the question and answer. But regardless, it was a bad deal, you could see. This was taken by Ted Grussing. Any fire managers in here know who Ted Grussing is. He's a frequent flyer on the Coconino. He lets us know when we put smoke in the red rocks, in case we didn't know. So this is one of his photos, and so pretty bad deal. And your scenario yesterday, make sure was up Oak Creek Canyon here. So you were up in here, just barely out of the frame. Okay, can't really leave without talking about why that happened, because it was definitely a surprise to us. We weren't anticipating that, it being the conditions that it was. But I think the biggest contributing factor was this high-level, low-pressure system that led to really poor weather forecasting. It's kind of a rare event. And when I say high level, I mean high altitude. And I want to make clear that this isn't a shot at the Weather Service. We get great service from the Weather Service, and generally their 24 to 48 hour weather forecasts are spot on, very reliable, high confidence, and we could plan well from there. That wasn't the case here because of this system. And I've been on the Coke since 2008 and cannot ever remember a low pressure system. And our smoke manager down in Phoenix, Ron Sharon, who works with ADQ, doesn't ever recall this high pressure low. But it caused the model variability to go all over the chart. So anyways, that was certainly a factor. And once again, the ventilation for the 5-day period I showed you was always very good or excellent, the 2 highest categories. But I don't think that's what happened. Having the open edge, that conservative approach resulted in having open edge fire, not tied to a road system like we normally would do. So that's a factor. Anytime you have open edge overnight and the fire continues to grow and smolder, normally we're done with ignitions in mid-afternoon. And we have to be pretty much if we're prescribed fire operations. And then the close proximity of our fire to Munns Park, the community in Munns Canyon, which leads right into Sedona, you'll see from this next fire, was a factor. And I know I underestimated this. I thought we were far enough away with the night flow that we anticipated. But this is how it looks. There's our origin down here. And there's Munns Park proper, leading to Munns Canyon, which leads right into Sedona. And so, as many of you know, smoke behaves like water at night with the cooling temperatures, and that flowed right down that canyon into Sedona. The obligatory ravage for you AFE folks that need this information, Ponderosa Pine was about 80% of our polygon. And so generally speaking, we got low to very low fire effects, but notice that that's not the land fire definition of low. It goes up to 25% basal area loss, or 50 instead of 25. So the fire effects were pretty desirable from our standpoint, and that tends to be the case when we have in-season burning. We get better fire effects. And better, I mean hotter. We kill more trees, consume more fuel. So that's what that was from a fire effects standpoint. And that's all I had.